Thank you very much for coming for the last session, MacGill Summer School 2025. We're delighted to see you all here today, and we're definitely ending on a bang. If you think back to 12 months ago, our last session was about the US presidential elections, and obviously we all know what that turned out, but it was a really interesting discussion. For this, we really want to end on a high, and we're delighted to have, let's talk about the presidency, so our upcoming presidential elections. And we've no better person to be able to guide us through this election period than our host for today. Please give a huge round of applause for Dearbhail McDonald, please. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. It is absolutely great to be back in Glenties. I haven't been here in a couple of years. The last time I was here, I entered into a raffle in a village when I was driving up, and it was for a calf. And I sort of came back to see was there any chance to have a won at that time. But it's brilliant to be back. Let's talk about the presidency. It's kind of we need to talk about the presidency. But the Irish presidency, the most importantly directly elected office in the state, imbued with symbolism, power and meaning. Is it the thinking man's monarchy? Or, to paraphrase my colleague Justine McCarthy, the Rose of Tralee for the over 35s? I think that it is true to say that few electoral processes ignite, inspire, galvanise and divide than the selection, nomination and running process that is the Irish presidency. And yet, if this morning's Irish Times is anything to believe, there isn't much voter interest, and voters aren't yet engaged in the race for the Irish, not yet. But as someone once said this morning, someone has to speak for the Irish people. That was Michael Flatley in his Am I or Am I Not Running? For the Irish when he appeared on with my colleague RT's Brendan O'Connor this morning. He is also consulting with a wide range of people. And I suppose, we're coming to the end of Michael D. Higgins' era as presidency, those 14 years. And I suppose every time it comes around, particularly after the particularly bruising, craziness of 2011, we're asking ourselves, what about the presidency? Why does it matter? Why are we not attracting, in the main, non-political candidates? Is the franchise too limited, and should it be open to people like my family who are from Northern Ireland and other non-resident Irish citizens? Should presidents like children be seen and not heard? And who, in their right minds, would actually run for it? And that's one of the reasons why we have a neuroscientist and clinical psychologist, Professor Ian Robertson, on the panel. You're very, very welcome, Ian. Professor David Kenny, Professor in Law and Head of the Law School at Trinity College, Dublin, my former alma mater. You're very, very welcome. And we have one person who wants to run for the presidency, a barrister and former minister, who, when she was last at MacGill trying to encourage young boys to access it, all I'm going to say is bats flew in the room, but it's not going to happen tonight. Mary Hanafin, you're welcome. And finally, author, entrepreneur and two-time presidential candidate, Sean Gallagher. You're all very, very welcome. I'm going to get the basics and the mechanics out of the way, first of all. David Kenny, what is the real significance of the office of the presidency from a legal and constitutional point of view? Because if you're running for it, it's very, very important, and if you've ruled yourself out, it's not. So just tell us what are actually the parameters of it.
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying I'm not ruling myself out yet, so we'll see how the evening goes. It's a fascinating office, the Irish presidency. It's very unusual. There are very few heads of state like it in the world. A presidency with very, very few formal powers. And in many ways, as Dearbhail suggested, it's almost like an elected monarchy in the sense that it's taking on many of the powers and functions that the monarch has in the Westminster system, and it's replicating them in the Irish constitutional order. So you have a head of state, though not explicitly called a head of state in the constitution for historical reasons, that provides sort of figurehead and international leadership, that has an order of precedence above all other citizens in the state. But
it's directly elected as opposed to being appointed.
Directly elected. And really the only big office we have where we have a direct election, the people elect the president directly. And it's really an astonishing office in that way. The strange thing about it is that it obviously has few formal powers. It's not an executive presidency. The president has no executive powers. Technically sits in the Oireachtas. It's part of the Oireachtas in the constitutional structure. And really, in terms of the powers the president can use without the instruction of the government, there are only two. They're significant, but they're also very limited. One is the President can refer bills to the Supreme Court to decide on constitutionality of a particular bill. That's been done semi-regularly, but not all that often, particularly only once in the last 20 years. And the other power, which has never really come into play officially, is that if the Taoiseach has lost the support of the majority of the Dáil and asks the President to dissolve the Dáil, the President can say no, presumably thinking that a different coalition, a different Taoiseach might emerge. That has never formally happened, though there may have been some influence of that power over the years. That's it in terms of the President's formal constitutional power. But I think, as we all know, having seen various presidents speak out on various issues, be national thought leaders, the office can be much more significant in its non-legal aspects.
But in strictly legal and constitutional terms, it's quite limited. And I wonder, Ian Robertson, if the role is largely symbolic, is that actually the genius of the Irish presidency? You know, what do you think it represents and what impact do you think it has if, as David has outlined, you know, the actual powers are quite limited?
I think it's a very clever mechanism in the Constitution, because being...
An Irish solution to an Irish problem.
Exactly. Because power, we know that power is a difficult thing for most people to handle. And we can see that throughout the world just now, and it creates terrible problems when people are not constrained in their power. And the thing about by separating two aspects of the power, one is the executive from the celebrity, symbolic, ritualistic aspects of it. And you might think that's not power, but it is power, because you have the power of influence. If you can influence other people, that is a very powerful form of power. And so what you're doing, you're dividing these. And you're sparing the poor Taoiseach, who, you know, has the awful, sparing them from the protection, if you like, of the aura and the celebrity of being president. Now, you don't get that in France or in America. And you can see that you know, Sarkozy, it went to his head very much, and most French presidents end up in some kind of legal action against them. And we don't have to talk about the current president as well. So I think it's a rather beautiful way of reducing the risk of power or corrupting the decisions or distorting the decisions of people.
Mary Hanafin, as I said earlier, you know, sometimes those who are running for the office or hoping to run for the office do stress that it is an important part of that separation of powers infrastructure, and that it does have an important constitutional legal function. But for you, why does the presidency matter? Because it's a multi-layered thing.
It's multi-layered, but it is the head of state. It is the most important, although it not be the most political position in the country. By being the head of state, you are the representative of the people and therefore the representative of the country abroad. You also have, I think, huge influence and huge power, and again, not in the political sense, but in the soft power, in influencing and in doing exactly what your oath says you are to do, which is to serve the people, dedicate your abilities to the service and welfare of the people of Ireland, but within the Constitution. And I think it's very clearly laid out, the separation of powers, and that has to be maintained. We're looking across the water where the separation of powers are being blurred between the President and the courts and the Congress. And if we didn't have that separation of powers, I think then all we would have would be yet another politician. And I know politicians have held the positions, but they're not politicians when they're in the position. And you actually have a really important role. And I think the key thing is the fact that it is directly elected. The Irish people of all ages love their president. Love their president. And that starts because they voted for their president. So there is that sense of ownership. And even younger people under the age of 35 who could never get to be president until they're 35, just look at the way they love Michael D, particularly. And they respond to him and they look at it. And different people require different things from their president. So that means the person who's looking to be that president has to bring with them into the campaign, I would think, an experience and a background that reflects the people we are today and the vast majority of the Irish people who are not to be found in the noise of the social media. The vast majority of Irish people who are tolerant and kind and empathetic and who are welcoming, that's who the President represents.
Sean Gallagher, you have been on record, I think, talking about how the office of the presidency needs to be reimagined and, in fact, expanded, I think, by referendum, if necessary, to get a better, return on investment for the public. What way should it be expanded, do you think? What possible more powers should or could the President have?
Well, I think if you look at the role of the President, I think David summed it up in his introduction from a constitutional point of view, and the powers and the two powers of Article 13 on the ability to refuse the dissolution of the Dáil when the Taoiseach has lost confidence, and Article 26 with regard to referring bills that may be repugnant to the Constitution. The first one has never been invoked, and the second one has happened, I think, about 16 times in the history of 90 years. So while that's the key that everybody talks about, it's seldom exercised. So then what is the role of the President for all the other time that the President is there? And it's back, and Mary has said, many politicians from the beginning of the state and when the role was first introduced have been, as you said, quiet and seldom heard and seldom seen. And I think the first move away from that was Carol O'Dowley in 1974 when he introduced the idea that while the President couldn't have a policy or a set of policies, they certainly could have a theme. And his theme through his presidency for his period was community spirit, which again is powerful. Mary MacGill then, or Mary Robertson, introduced the idea of the light in the window, the diaspora, Manana Heron, speaking to somebody here last night in the bar who said that she was a young person at the time and it changed her life. The inspiration that a woman could stand for the highest office, and she said she had shivers watching the inauguration of Mary Robertson.
Because the hand that rocked the cradle rocked the system.
There you go. Mary MacGill, what was her theme? Building on her passion, her background, her lived experience was bridges across the border of peace. Michael D, based on his lifetime in politics, was about human rights and about ethics. But here's the thing. It's the most bizarre role and job, if you call it a job. There's a very scant job description. And what it says is you protect articles in the Constitution, and then it's effectively you do whatever you think is your particular theme.
So what would you have a president do? What would you have a president do that they're not doing right now?
Yeah. And I remember in 2011 watching the poll at the time of a significant number of people who came back and said we should abolish the role of president. And I asked a lot of them, why? Because it's got no power, Sean. And I said, and also it costs about 10 million a year. So Michael D's presidency and Mary MacGill's is about 140 million investment that we could, as people said to me, we could put in hospital beds, we could look after the homeless, we could take kids off waiting lists. And yet, I have been on so many trips abroad on delegations that I understand abroad, as Mary has said, the power of the president of a country.
Which is probably a multiplier effect of the money that we put into it.
Correct. And so it's not lost on me what I was trying to do in 2011, that 14 years later, one of the greatest challenges the country has is from a president who is an entrepreneur, a TV personality, and in real estate, the three things that I was at the time. And that's not lost on me. I would be like, today somebody said, who should be having the conversation? I would like to be at the table today talking to an entrepreneur. Because here's the thing I understand. If you look at the likes of Donald Trump, and just to use that as an example, Donald Trump, and I think people are making a mistake in dealing with him, they're applying a political brain to Donald Trump.
But that's an executive presidency.
But here's the thing. Who has he appointed as his ambassador to Ireland?
A golfer.
He hasn't appointed
and a businessman.
He hasn't appointed a politician. He has appointed a champion golfer that plays in his golf club, that is a construction company owner in New Jersey. And I've met him in Washington before he came over, and I met him at the 4th of July celebration.
But how does that track back to the Irish presidency? If you were to give the office of the Irish presidency more powers, what would it be? Do you want to see more executive power?
Well, here's the thing is, at home...
Because entrepreneurialism is a theme.
Yeah, entrepreneurialism is a theme, and it's of its time. I'm not saying that all presidents need to be entrepreneurial and lead trade missions. There's a time. But what I'd love to see is when you go out for any office, you're looking for somebody to serve a particular purpose. That can't be based on the personality of what my preference is. It's got to be on the country. And one of the things, there was a point made here yesterday, is that political governments and politicians, by the nature of the system, are curtailed into a 3-year horizon to the next election, to survive to the next election. We now, I think, and the President can be part of leading this, if you look at other states, they have a 20 to 30-year vision of what they want the country to be. And I think the President can have a major role outside of the executive powers to help paint that picture of what Ireland could look like, and also to give us a sense of confidence, because it's one of the things we lacked in 2011 post the crash. Everything was about how bad things were. When I went abroad, everybody was talking about the basket case that was Ireland. Yet in my community, I saw resilience, I saw community spirit, I saw families, I saw businesses, organisations, I saw people who believed that they could do better. But there was no confidence being instilled from a national or an international point of view.
Well, let's actually then, thank you sort of for helping me maybe segue into this, David Kenny. Let's talk about that relationship between the presidency and the government of the day, because many of the powers that or even the conventions that the office of the presidency is allowed to do has to be on the advice stroke sort of consent of the government. So obviously referring a bill, dissolution of the Dáil, but also if they're going to make a major address to the nation or overseas, technically that has to go through. And I'm just wondering, has that line blurred in more recent decades? And how important is it to hold that line between the Dáil, which is elected to run the country on the one house, the houses have their function, and then the President? Do you think that line has been crossed a little bit more in recent years?
It's a complicated relationship. As you've said, other than the two powers we discussed when the President gets to make their own decision, every other power the President has can only be exercised if the government or the Taoiseach says so. So basically every other power is in the control of the government. And there is a clause in the Constitution that says if the President gets any more powers by law, they also have to be essentially exercised by the government, and the President doesn't have any discretion. So the office is designed not to accumulate extra power that way. That was in part actually because one of the most...
Or not to act against the government.
That's it. One of the most controversial things about the Constitution, weirdly, in hindsight, was the President. People thought that it was going to be an office that one day De Valera would take up and kind of rule like a king. Now, if we look back on what the presidency has become, that seems very silly, but that actually was a concern kind of aired in the debates on the Constitution. So, therefore, you do see a line being drawn between the President and the political sphere. As you've said, the President can only address the nation on content that the government has sort of approved. The President can't travel abroad without the government's permission, and we know of a few instances in Mary Robinson's time and in Carúil O'Dálaig's time when the government has said no, you can't go on that trip, because the government has power over foreign policy, ultimately, and the President can't be taking trips that might complicate
But if you're the conscience of the nation and you have this public mandate, should you be allowed off the constitutional leash from time to time?
Well, that's it, and that's why I think that the controversy has been about the Presidents speaking their mind. The President is not otherwise muzzled in terms of what they can say when in office. If the President wants to comment on a matter of policy and politics, we might say that's inadvisable. We might say there's a convention that the President doesn't do it. But the Constitution doesn't say that the President cannot comment on matters of active policy and politics. It's probably wise that they don't, because they need to maintain that political independence if they have to use those couple of important powers.
You know, Mary Hanafin, you had mentioned earlier, you know, just about how, unlike other jurisdictions, we do get to directly elect this office. So we kind of know the cut of their jib. By the time we'll go through the process, we'll talk about the electoral or the selection and nomination process later. But do you think that they should be allowed to push the, if not the constitutional boundaries, the boundaries of convention when it comes to having that voice that they have, which is arguably the greatest power that an Irish president has?
I do, and I think each of the presidents used it very well. I think Mary Robertson used it for the diaspora and for women. Like I said, I think Mary MacGill used it very well in the whole North-South relations. Michael D has used it for social justice. I don't know what the next president will use it for, but one thing I would be clear on is that it still must be within the constitutional parameters, or else you're breaking down those boundaries.
In what sense?
I think, for example, I think most officials in foreign affairs nearly had a fit when Michael D started talking at the United Nations, because they didn't know what he was going to say. All right? So he pushed the boundaries in talking about world problems, but he didn't go beyond it. He didn't go beyond his constitutional role. And I think that the next president, or any president, should not start where he has finished. You bring it back to the start again and push your own boundaries, because times change, issues change, problems change. The debate that you want to generate, the campaign that you are quietly launching can be done within that constitution. So of course you can speak out, of course you can do it, but I would strongly believe it has to be within that constitution.
Is the risk that perhaps if somebody comes along in the future who has views that aren't shared with the population, or perhaps have morphed perhaps during their time up in Phoenix Park, is there a risk that it could come into conflict with the government of the day and that office?
I doubt if the President would come into conflict with the people of Ireland and what they might say, because they will be trying to reflect what they believe the people say. But they would certainly come into conflict with the government, and certainly come into conflict with the Oireachtas, and that, I think, would be dangerous.
Ian, trust matters. It's probably the most important currency that we have, and we do expect our leaders to share or reflect the values of the population, whether elected to the Houses or directly elected to the office of presidency. So should presidents be campaigners? Should they, you know, especially when they're addressing very, very tough issues or controversial ones, when they have that prominence on the public stage that particularly the Irish presidency has?
So trust is the essential glue of gluing human beings together. And trust is based on the perception of shared values. And that's what human groups throughout evolution have managed to work together, because I think you share my values and therefore I trust you. And the great thing about the presidency is it is essentially a moral position. It's the moral authority, the moral power. And therefore, to be a campaigning president, to be an advocacy president, will inevitably dilute or even destroy that moral power.
So should they stay away or certainly above political decisions?
Yeah, because there's a new emotion, a new human emotion that was only identified in the last decade by a psychologist called Jonathan Haidt. And it's the emotion that I felt, for example, 2 years ago when I was watching President Zelensky give his New Year address to the Ukrainian people, you know, the darkest hour. It was Churchillian. And I felt this strange feeling in my chest and a little bit teary listening to this. And that emotion has been identified. It's called moral elevation. It's called moral elevation. And it occurs I'm sure many people in this room have experienced it. It's when you witness an act that is inspiring, or a person that's inspiring by an action of altruism, of self-sacrifice, or some act of generosity. I think ideally that what the presidency is about is creating trust in a state of 5 million, 6 million people.
I would worry that concept of moral elevation can cut in a positive but as well as in a negative response.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, Sean Gallagher, if one of the greatest assets of the Irish presidency is that it is an independent voice, are there circumstances in which that independent voice can be too independent? Should that voice be curtailed?
I think there is a wisdom in not overstepping the independence, because you do not want to have a Taoiseach and a president in conflict about where a country stands. I think that is divisive. I think back to David's point about Article 13.10 that talks about that the role that powers can be conveyed on the president by law within the confines of the Constitution and with the approval of government, means that there are lots of things that the President could be empowered to do within the role of the Constitution. However, I would suggest that if you ask everybody in this room what the role of the President would be, you would get a lot of different views. And while we have had debate about the age of the nomination process and the length of the term, I think it's time now that we had a national conversation about what the role should be as we move into a time very different than 1937 when it was enacted. That's 90 years ago. Ireland has changed.
Give me one new power you'd give the
changed.
President. Give me one new power you'd give the President.
I personally, at this moment in time where we are, what we need is a voice abroad. Every minister, and this is the challenge, you heard Thomas Byrne talking earlier, what's his primary objective? His constituents in Meath. He said it 3 times. He has to work after his constituents. The President doesn't. He has to look after a government department. The President doesn't. So today, we could have a President on the stage attracting foreign direct investment into Ireland, promoting those companies that we talked about through Mark Little and Lucinda earlier, in terms of taking Irish companies abroad, attracting tourism, attracting students to come to Ireland, tapping into the 40 million Americans and the global... I was in Canada recently.
Is that not the IDA, Enterprise Ireland, all of those agencies?
I have been on so many of those trade missions. Enterprise Ireland is a state agency that's a public servant that talks to another state agency that talks to companies. The power, and I was in the room at Mary McAleese when she was in Shanghai, the power when a president walks into a room of business leaders in China is beyond anything that you would experience from here, because we are so close to the President, because we see them at events, at football matches. The power of the President internationally is incredible. And I take Ian's view on moral elevation. We've all had teachers in our schools who have inspired us. We've had sports leaders and coaches that inspired us to be more than we can be. We've had leaders in the community, and we'd have global leaders who have inspired us. Why can't the President be one of those that inspires us to be better than we are now and to elevate all of us in every single way, individually, family, community, business and nationally?
Yeah, sometimes
Sorry,
I think
Dermot,
perhaps...
could I just pick up on that? Because, like Sean, I've been on all those trips, right, as Minister for Education, Minister for Tourism, etc. And I think what the President can do is not stand up and say, we have the lowest corporation tax. Not stand up and say that we have X number of multinationals in Ireland, but you can talk about your people. You can talk about the Irish people are a well-educated, resilient people who are available, willing and able to work and to take their place in the world. You don't have to get into the policies of it or the politics of it to actually reflect who the Irish people are. And that's where I see the President in being the icing on the cake for what the politicians are trying to do.
So it mightn't necessarily need to be set out in the Constitution. I want to turn to David Kenny just about an issue, and I know this is something that any of us who come from the north of Ireland often get quite exercised about, and that is the franchise. We have one of the most restrictive franchises. There are many, many other countries where non-residents who are citizens nonetheless can get to vote in an array of elections, including the presidential election. There seemed to be a pushback against it, perhaps because political referenda tend not to do very, very well. Don't mention the more recent wars. But there is pushback, perhaps, that a fear that it would be lost, that the franchise would be too big. Is there scope for the presidency, if for nothing else, to loosen those restrictions?
I think that's why the presidency has been the object of discussion about citizens abroad being able to vote. Because as you said, we have one of the most restrictive franchises in terms of the length of time that you are still eligible to vote if you leave the state, and also very limited postal voting, even if you're temporarily absent from the state on the day of an election or a referendum. It's really difficult to get a postal ballot. It's possible, but you'll end up with...
I think of the phenomenal home to vote movement that attended the marriage equality referendum.
Exactly, and many people who've been out of the country for a few years will lose the eligibility to vote. So to try and expand that, we're going to try, I think, and expand postal voting more generally, but it's much trickier, and people disagree a lot more about what elections people should be allowed to vote in if they have been out of the country for a long period of time. And the presidency is something that's been discussed as a way of extending the vote to citizens beyond the state as it currently is. The Constitution says to vote in a presidential election, you have to be a citizen, but you also have to be eligible to vote in Dáil elections. So you have to be resident in a Dáil constituency. So in order to expand the franchise to citizens in Northern Ireland or anywhere else, you would have to change the Constitution to say that the presidential election franchise is citizens wherever they may be resident, and then we could put in place a postal system for that. I think the concern, as you said, people have concerns about emigrant voting in terms of taxation and representation. There are ways around that for the Dáil with things like emigrant constituencies and so on, but the presidency has been the focus because if we're talking about the conscience and the voice of a nation, then surely citizens beyond the borders of the state and beyond Dáil constituencies might have an entitlement to have their say.
Mary Hanafin, do you think that the franchise should be extended or some of those restrictions lessened, particularly for people in the north of Ireland who, you know, we've had Mary McAleese, we've had a peace process president, but people in the north can't vote?
Not yet, and not in isolation. I think there's not enough understanding between communities within Northern Ireland and north-south. I think when you look last week, you look at the effigies, you look at the bonfires, you realise there's still a journey to go before we get any kind of real understanding and real political understanding.
Is that not denying to our citizens in the north that opportunity to vote? Are we telling them to wait?
Well, I think what we're saying is that the shared island idea needs to be progressed. That we need to have more cooperation on the things that are actually working within Northern Ireland, which will help to break down the boundaries. For example, Tourism Ireland is a north-south body, works really, really well. The Middleton Centre for Autism, for training of teachers and supports for young people north and south, is working really well. So there's huge scope for extending the cooperation. But just suddenly coming along and giving a franchise to a people when the basic level of acceptance and understanding isn't there at a community level, never mind a presidential level.
Ian, any thoughts?
I would say give everyone with an Irish passport the vote, wherever they are.
And that's probably one of the fears, that the potential size of the electorate would dwarf it, would dwarf the actual electorate here.
It would dwarf the electorate, and it would engage engage people who feel disenfranchised. It would be a powerful binder of the diaspora. There would be risks. Hopefully, certain people wouldn't rise to the ballot, but I think we have a sophisticated electorate that would rise to that.
Once more with feeling, Sean Gallagher, a fellow border native. Should it be extended? Should the franchise be extended? Should it be done in a piecemeal fashion? Should it extend to the north? Should it then extend to diaspora? Do you think it's too limited?
I think the question of harnessing the connectivity between the diaspora and Ireland, I think, is totally untapped. I don't think it needs to be a vote, but I do think there needs to be a reach out and an embracement of the diaspora. We could be doing so much more with the talent pool that we have, the relationships we have, the wealth that we have abroad that would invest in Ireland. All of that needs to be dealt with. I'm not sure that giving somebody a vote will achieve that. I think it could be part of it. I think there's a lot of work needs to be done to look at, as David has said, other models to see how many years out of Ireland would you need to be. If you're living 20 years abroad somewhere and you haven't been in Ireland for 20 years, does that entitle you to still have a vote? I think there needs to be an assessment, and again, I wouldn't be opposed to that at all. The question I would have is, how do we get our population here to engage and vote? They're not coming out to vote in Ireland, and they live here, and they're paying tax here, and they're facing all the challenges. And there's a disconnect right across the political divide, not just in presidential elections, but in general elections. People are losing out of apathy. They are feeling so disconnected from the political process. They are not seeing real, on-the-ground action for the problems they have of health and housing and everything else. And they're disengaging from the political process. And in that disengagement, I fear a vacuum is being created that could be filled by a lot of the hatred that we're seeing spewed across social media. I worry about that more than I worry about the international votes, although I'm open to it.
Might break everybody's heart in the north to think that they're an international vote. Can I stay with you, Sean Gallagher? I want to talk to you about the nomination process, which is quite restrictive, limited to the main political parties. You have to go and get your 4 county councils, or unless you're an incumbent and you can nominate yourself again. Should the nomination process be more open, in your view?
Again, back to when the Constitution was first drafted in 1937, you have to think of the political landscape at the time, and then you move that forward now to where we have with fragmentation of independents and smaller parties. And yet, and here's an exercise for all of us in the room. If any single one of you or I decided today that we wanted to become president, what would you do? How would you, if you thought you had a contribution, a skill set to bring forward to help the country at this point in time, how would you get through the process? Firstly, you would have to get 20 Oireachtas members. So if you're not in a political party, how are you going to get 20 TDs and senators to nominate you, if they've already got party members? And then you say, well, OK, I can't get through the Oireachtas. I need to go to the councils. I need 4 councils. Well, here's a little bit of awareness. Most of the councils are dominated by the same political parties. So, to give an example, in 2011, and Cathal Lee, my campaign manager here, and Richard, who worked in our campaign this year, will tell you that we launched very early on and went on a tour of the councils. And I can tell you, sitting at a council meeting, firstly, this is the challenge, if anybody's thinking of going now, you need to write to the council and get invited. So they will have a council meeting after you write to them to consider having you at the next meeting. There's 2.5 months gone. We got to a council meeting.
So you don't have a campaign until you have a nomination?
You have to have a nomination. You can't fundraise, you can't build a team, you can't build a social media, you can't get posters ready, nothing until you know you're in the race. And that's why the political parties very astutely leave it to the last minute so that they don't give you time as an independent to get ready for the election. We went to a council meeting in a council, I won't mention the county, and it was on the 2nd month, and we were sitting there waiting, our item on the agenda, to address the council and seek the nomination. A particular party had the majority, and they had a diktat to exercise the whip so that they had a candidate nationally standing and not to support any independents. And literally at 4 o'clock, having 2 or 3 hours of the council meeting, the chairman wrote a note and passed it round to all his fellow party colleagues that said, there's a half an hour to go, talk the clock down. And so they talked the clock down, we had driven down, and at 4 o'clock the chairman says, very sorry Mr Gallagher, we can't take this, come back next month. Now, if you're waiting to pull a team together, to fundraise, which is the guts of 500,000, to put a team around and when people come to me, and I've spoken to a number of independent candidates who are seeking to go, I say, you have to have a nomination, because here's the question. If you're in South Dublin or Donegal, who is going to hang up your posters in West Galway or South Kerry? You need to build a team. And so we started in May, went to the country on a listening tour to the thousands of people. People thought I came from nowhere. I was 10 years in community halls and groups and schools, long-term unemployed groups, trying to give them the very confidence and courage that I was talking about during the campaign.
So we came back with... You had a network. We had a network, but even with that network, we had to get the nomination. Now, we were lucky in that we had the work done and we knew the process. And so I not only got 4 counties, I got 12. And I wrote to the other councils and I said, look,
I know how difficult the process is, so it would be unfair of any of us to sit on those councils. Please go ahead and nominate Dan or Mary Davis or whatever. But it took us months to get in the race. Only I had built 10 years of a team, and we came back 3 months later with 2,500 people in my campaign. We built an army within 4 months. That's very hard if you're not sure you're going to get a nomination.
And if you've never done that before, Mary Hanafin, should Ireland's call be a much more open one? Is it too restrictive, or do you think that the system and the filters that it has largely serves the public well?
Well, in the first instance, it's a right and a privilege that is given to elected public representatives. And because they have that privilege, they should use it. So,
your party hasn't yet. Your party hasn't yet used it.
No, and I mean, leaving Mary Hanafin or anybody else aside, I firmly believe that the largest party in the country, which is the largest at local level, largest at national level, largest in Europe, should be running a candidate.
Who should that person be, Mary? Would you
but I mean this genuinely. Just leave me out of it. For two good reasons. First of all, I think it's an insult to the office of President if you're willing to run for everything, but you won't run for the office of President. And secondly, I think you have an obligation to give the people of Ireland a choice. Because it is the politicians who give you that choice. It's the people who elect the President at the end of the day. But you can only do it out of the ballot paper of candidates that the politicians have actually presented
David Kenny, you know, the main political parties don't have a particularly good record when it comes to whatever about selecting or nominating candidates. Getting them to win is a trickier question. Do you think that there should be filters, or do you think that the current system does serve it well? It's unlikely to be an issue that goes for a referenda anytime soon, I suspect.
Yeah, I think the design of the system was to make sure that a person running for president was taken seriously within the political system, that either from national representatives or from local councils, this was someone that could establish themselves as a serious political figure if they're going to be head of state. Now, obviously, in practice, it does provide a mechanism for, if parties choose to close down these routes, then you could get very few candidates. I suppose what you would say is, looking at the last couple of presidential elections, the fields haven't been tiny. This is a system that is producing a robust number of candidates.
Particularly in 2011.
Particularly in 2011. That was a big field. And so there, I think, has to be some filter mechanism, because otherwise we're just asking the media or someone else to filter for us, because we won't be able to listen to everyone. Now, there has been suggestions over the years, a couple of Oireachtas committees and other groups have suggested that we should have a citizens' engagement system, 10,000 signatures or some other mechanism that citizens themselves could nominate someone for president. And if we say, citizens take this person
I'm a president,
seriously,
get me out of here.
Yeah, perfect.
I want to be a president, get me out of here.
And then if we think that a certain number of citizens are willing to take this person seriously, we could trust that they are a serious candidate. But there has to be some filter.
I'm going to get to the actual campaigns in shortly. That's why we wanted a psychologist on stage. But the population, you might say, does take the presidency seriously. 71% when asked, should anyone under 35 be allowed to occupy the role of the president, said no. It was a really, really definitive no, and in a sense that referendum, obviously the one about reducing the term didn't go before the public reduced it from 7 to 5, but that showed sort of a sophistication well, it depends if you're under 35, but it sort of showed the seriousness perhaps by which the population takes it. So do you think that do you think there should be filters, and who gets to decide what those filters should be?
Well, I think the 35 is a good plan. I just wish I was at that age so I could stand. But the thing is, the human brain, particularly the male brain, isn't fully wired up till the early 30s. The frontal lobes and the memory centres aren't. That's
all the ladies going, uh-huh.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
saying nothing.
So it's a good age, and also imagine being 30-year-old and having to sit through all these ceremonies. And I mean, it would be a terrible, terrible job for someone under 35 to do. Yeah, assuming you're an ambitious person with ambitions for the country, I think it would be a tough job. So I don't. But in terms of the lowering the bar and changing the filters. The problem is we have Brexit largely because a number of people manipulated the Cambridge Analytica, etc. They targeted people. They got people out to vote who would not normally vote. and vote on issues that had nothing to do with leaving.
And it was
the EU.
largely older people who voted in favour of it.
Yeah, and I remember Ian Duncan Smith saying smugly after we thought there was going to be yes, saying, "Oh, I believe I've heard the people in the estates are coming out to vote," you know. And these are people who were, you know, Sun readers normally wouldn't have voted in a referendum, but were voting because they were unhappy with several years of Osbornean austerity.
I thought they were going to get 350 million a week.
Yeah. And so that's the risk if you reduce some of the filters in this social media world, the manipulation of an electorate to get some character, whether it's a martial arts person or whatever. Yeah.
Let's just turn to that, and before we go to the audience, let's just turn, Mary Hanafin, to the once you've been nominated and the process itself. You have contested, won, lost, you know, many elections. You've been blooded by the system, in a manner of speaking. And sometimes when you see people of substance, people of stamina, with good reputations, they come before it and they put their ideas before the crowd, they put everything before the crowd, and they get annihilated by this process, particularly, I think, not exclusively, but particularly for women. Do you identify with that fear? Like, are you daunted? If you get on the ticket, would you be daunted by the prospect of this being a very, very different election than a regular one?
As you say, Dearbhail, I've looked at really good people, A.D. Roach, Mary Davis, Joan Freeman, all of whom, Dana, were battered and bruised. They did their best with Mary McAleese, you might remember. They did their best with Mary Robertson. But looking at it, I think the people who suffered most during the campaigns, and Sean is slightly different because his battering was, he got no opportunity to answer a false tweet, which was so wrong. So I just want to put you in a different category, right? But looking particularly at the women, like you said, Dearbhail, not one of those women, other than the two presidents who were elected, had ever contested an election before. And there is something about putting your face on a poster, knocking on a door, being in front of the people, that hardens you, which might not be the type of president you want, but it does harden you for the campaign. Unfortunately, what you can't do is harden yourself against the social media. So I think the mainstream have a really important obligation to make sure that the campaigns are professionally, efficiently and respectfully run. The difference is, in a general election, you have 500 candidates, you have 40 different constituencies, so they don't have time to focus on one person. For the presidential election, they have 5, 6, 7, 8 candidates, and it's like 10 green bottles, except instead of getting them to fall, they just shoot them, one after the other, to see who's the last person standing. And it is a vicious campaign, I know that. If it was me, if I was lucky to be enough to be standing, I would love to win. I actually wouldn't mind losing if I still kept my reputation. And I think any candidate who runs for the office of president should at least be guaranteed that their reputation is intact, because they put themselves out.
But of course, David Kenny, that can't be guaranteed. I often think the reason why I will never run, I wouldn't survive 1, if not 2 days of the opposition research. Have you ever? Yes. And that, yes, of course. But do we expect our candidates to be squeaky clean? You know, if you've lived a lived life, particularly in the social media landscape, you know, that we have now, there is something about the presidency that is like a blood sport. And there is a viciousness and a visceral quality to it that is really can be quite extraordinary, you know. And I don't know if anybody listened to Dana, when she was interviewed by Oliver Callan recently, and seeing the impact that this can have on people's lives. There are others who will say, well, you know, the Irish public by and large has returned quality presidents, notwithstanding the Colosseum-style process that it has turned into. So is there a balance? Do we need a certain level of robustness? Or how would you even police that if you were of the view that it's too much?
Yeah, I think in light of your question, I might rule myself out now at this point. an hour in. I think it's a huge issue. I think the campaigns have gotten more difficult. There was a time when electing the Irish president was kind of choosing between two grandees of the major political parties, and I think for the benefit of everyone, the campaign is now broader. Many more people have a chance to be elected, but as a result, the intensity of the scrutiny has escalated. I think one of the issues is what we were talking about earlier. The president has limited powers. So when you're talking to someone about what they would do as president, there's really only so much they can tell you. In terms of the actual legal functions of the office, there's very little they can say. So therefore, unlike when we're talking about who we might want as Taoiseach, we can ask all sorts of policy questions. We're kind of left in the presidential election just to talk about people's personal qualities and values because, as we've been saying, it's about communication, it's about representing the conscience of a nation. But as such, and because we can't focus on substantive policy, I think there is a tendency for the campaigns to become very sort of probing and quite unpleasant, and I think it will lead to fewer people wanting to put themselves forward for the office if it continues that way.
Ian Robertson, without prejudice to the mental health status of the people on both sides of this panel, can I ask you, why, you're a neuroscientist and a clinical psychologist, why would anyone put themselves through such a gruelling and, I think Mary described us, it's nearly like pellets, you're taken down until there's the last one standing. Well, what sort of psychological makeup do you need to run for presidency in Ireland?
Well, you have to be resilient, as Mary was saying. What politicians have to endure these days in social media is just, no one should be forced to be put through that, particularly women politicians. It's just disgusting what they have to endure. And that will be, the more prominent you are, the worse it is. So you need to have this emotional robustness and resilience, which will be critical. But there's three basic motivations that drive human beings. One is for to be liked by other people and accepted, and the corresponding fear is the fear of rejection. For achievement, that is to achieve things, and the corresponding fear is fear of failure. And then the other one is for power or autonomy, and the corresponding fear is fear of loss of control. And so for the presidency, for most politicians, they have to have an appetite for power. They have to probably, if you want to have an impact and change things in a system, you need to...
And that applies to soft power as well as hard power.
Absolutely. You need to and of course, if you have an appetite for power that doesn't become too great, that's an antidote to stress and anxiety, so it makes you more resilient. So you have to have that appetite. All politicians, all managers have to have that. So, you need drive to be the president. But the other thing about, the other possible aspect of motivation that's less
common... You also need incredible self-belief.
You have to have self-belief. And one of the strongest bases of self-belief is to feel impelled by something greater than yourself. By some value, some mission that you are, if you like, being carried along for. Now that's a big ask for anyone. But it's that inspiration, it's that moral inspiration. This is a big value that I want to enact within the limited powers of the Constitution that I have. And if you have that, the evidence is if you know what your values are and you affirm them, that's a huge source of resilience. The amygdala part of the brain that produces anxiety gets dampened down when you do what's called self-affirmation of your values. And so you need strong values. You need to be impelled by something that feels bigger than yourself. You need to have an appetite for power that will help you reduce the stress. You need obviously high achievement motivation. And you maybe don't need to be liked too much. Needing to be liked can be a terrible impediment for being effective.
But is that not true also? Because I spend a lot of time having these conversations with people who want to launch a business or students about what they want to do with their future career. And I totally get the achievement, the purpose beyond yourself. But isn't it true for anywhere you go to serve? If you want to be a teacher or a doctor, let's say for a teacher, you have learning that you want to impart. Why would you not just keep it to yourself? Because you're propelled by this desire to enhance manhood and womanhood and help people grow and develop their potential and to learn. If you're a broadcaster, You have news, and you want to spread that to the world because that would enlighten more people. If
What
you're a
propels
politician,
you,
you
Sean
want to
Gallagher?
service.
What propels you?
Propels me. It's no different from my life when I was a youth worker, when I grew businesses, when I trained entrepreneurs, when I coach people. It is about human potential. The thing that frustrates me is negativity. I hate negativity because I want to say to people, stop running down our country. Let's talk about the good things. Let's stop being victims in our own lives. What can we do at our own careers, our own families, our own communities, our own country? Why are we afraid? Because we're inhibited by this Irish psyche that says, don't get notions. Don't get above your station. I say, to hell with that. Get above your station. Be the best you can be. And I want to say that for this reason, is that there is a mentality in Ireland, and it is to take us down. Let's take each other down rather than build each other up. I have always had the philosophy, and it was I didn't run a campaign on a slogan. I ran a campaign on exactly what Ian is saying, my values, what I've lived my life by. I will never grow an inch taller by putting somebody else down. Never in the 2011 campaign did I criticise one of the other candidates. You know why? Because I turned to them all and said, as Mary says, for a democracy to work, we need people to stand. How are people going to stand if we annihilate the reputation? We're watching now, 1 week after another, candidate going, I'm not standing, I'm declaring myself out. Why? For the office that so many people should want to represent Ireland. Why? Because we have made it unattractive, because we know we're going to attack all these people.
Sean Gallagher,
I think that's wrong in a democracy, and I would want to say to this, anybody who has a desire to stand, we should encourage them, promote them, and do away with negativity. That will make us a better country, not a worse
one. It would,
one.
and if you were going to launch a campaign anywhere, the story it's done in Glenties would be a great one. Are you going to stand? Are you going to, Sean Gallagher, we know your story to an extent, and I know you've spoken about the social media landscape, I know you've spoken about your experiences, but here you are one of the people who has been mentioned in dispatches again. Given what you have just said, are you going to stand?
No is the answer, and not that I have any fear, but because my life has moved on. My time was my time. And before we finish this, I would like to say something about social media, because I think social media, and now AI, is going to be a deciding factor in this election, for good and bad. There's lots. I use social media.
The deciding or a deciding? The deciding factor or a deciding?
A deciding factor. There'll be media, and then there'll be social media and AI. I can say that I was most likely the first victim of fake news in a presidential campaign. What happened to me, if it happened in any other country, people would have, there would have been sanctions. There would have been sanctions. We send observers over to other democratic countries to make sure there are fair elections. In what country is it right that you can have a fake tweet put to a presidential candidate in the dying days of a campaign, with a moratorium just about to land the day after? Not only was it fake, and I could forgive somebody making a mistake, but RTE and the producers knew 30 minutes before the end of that live programme that it was fake. And they allowed me to sing. And the following morning, on Pat Kenny's show, they did not correct it. Now, take me out of it.
You took action in respect of that.
But take me out of it for the moment, because I want to make sure that that can't happen anywhere. And so take my emotions and my reputation and all of that out of it. That is unfair. And in a democratic country where the state broadcaster is morally and legally supposed to uphold fairness, impartiality and objectivity, that did not happen. And that is why I took the case.
And I know, because you've explained why you took that action. David, can I ask you, at a time when we are seeing obviously advances in AI, risks to all sort of processes, the social media landscape is here. It's going to play a role in elections here, and it's obviously playing a role in elections elsewhere. To what extent can the law step in to regulate that? Because in the past, when someone like Mary Hanafin's knocking on the doors, she can at least see who her opponent is, or can see that, and now a lot of it is behind anonymity, it's behind all sorts of things online.
Yeah, I mean, we have tried to enact a law that would maybe enable us to tackle some of this. In the Electoral Act of 2023, we have provisions to try and regulate social media. There's an attempt in that legislation to put something together. That has been stalled because the European Union, it seems, has an objection to it on the basis that Ireland may not be empowered to do that itself because it will involve regulation of social media companies and so on. I think negotiations may be going on in the background about that, but it appears that that has stalled out. I think if that's what happens, that's a concern. It's not that that law is perfect or would necessarily work to combat the problems that we're seeing, but I think we have to try. The law is always behind the path of technology. We're always reacting to technology we can't fully control. But I think it would be very difficult if member states of the EU were not able to attempt to regulate their electoral process in the way that they
Mary Hanafin, just before I go to the audience, how do you deal with that? Because obviously when you first come into political life, social media was not there, and it certainly wasn't there to the extent that it is today. How do you deal with the abuse or the anonymity, whatever it is that comes your way?
I don't look at it. I actually don't. I don't. I get other people to track it for me to see if there's something that needs to be answered. But it has gone terrifying, to be honest. And I mean, in reality, there was one man, every, might say, female politician has had them, who stalked me, the only way to describe it. He turned up everywhere. He would be in front of me. And the guards went to see him. That didn't work. But we knew who he was. We knew where he lived. And how did I get him to stop? I got onto his mammy. That is as sure as I'm sitting here. And his mammy got onto him and calmed him down. But that's because he was a name and a face and a real person. Right? Social media, nameless, faceless, may not even be real people. So I think the only thing you could do in a campaign like this is to keep a million miles away from it and let your loyal team of supporters take the abuse on your behalf. And just
I think the mummies of Ireland have enough on their plates now without having to try and police elections at the same time. I'm going to open it up to the floor. We have roving mics. Can I just make a quiet appeal as a recovering legal affairs editor who has attended more legal conferences than I bear to even think about. And there's a thing that lawyers do at conferences where when it comes to the Q&A they make a submission. I want to get to as many people as possible, so I was wondering if I go to you with, could you perhaps ask a question as opposed to submission. I'm going to go to this gentleman here and to this lady first. But before we do, another name that has been mentioned in dispatches is former SDLP leader Colm Eastwood, who is here this evening. And I just thought, why don't we, since I've bounced for Sean Gallagher into making a class of a declaration, Colm, some of your reflections this evening, and are you hoping to run? Are you hoping to get a nomination?
Well, after tonight, I'm not sure.
We have a clinical psychologist literally available.
We're going to talk after this, actually, I think. Look, I mean, a number of people from different political parties have spoken to me about it. I think they seem to have spoken to half the country. Actually, listened to all the names of people who've ruled themselves out. But it's something that's worth considering, and it's something that I am considering over the next few weeks. But I think what's most important, actually, when I listen to all the discussion about what powers the President has and everything else, is what the vision the President is going to have is. And I think that is what will begin to ignite this contest, because right now, I looked at the poll in the Irish Times this morning, and nobody's too excited about this election. But in my view,
until we have a full list of candidates.
Well, exactly. But in my view, the next decade in this country is going to be about how we bring this country back together again. As Mary said, we don't know each other that well. I live an hour away, and I'll not have a vote in this election. I don't think we should be saying not yet to that. I think we should be rushing to bring back the society together again. I sometimes think it's like the children of divorced parents who never got to meet each other growing up, and how they're trying to build a relationship. And I think that is what the next president should be trying to do, is bring this country back together again. As John Hume taught me and many others, it's about uniting the people of this country, and I think that's where the debate should go. And I hope whoever the candidates are and whoever the president is will take up that mantle that I think a whole new generation are looking for somebody to raise.
Will you actively seek the nomination of councils or the established parties?
Well, look, I'm going to give the politician's answer because I too have been a politician for a long time. We'll see. Genuinely, it is a huge thing to think about. I have a lot of work to do. I'm the MP for Derry. I'm leading the New Ireland Commission. I'm a recovering party leader. And I think, actually, we have to think about these things deeply. I think anybody, like Mary, I'm sure, has as well, who's thinking about this, needs to think, what can I actually bring? You know, what is the vision that we're going to bring to the country? Not, you know, have I got somewhere nice to live for 7 years? So I'm considering it, and we'll see where that goes. But I think a lot of candidates who are out too early are beginning to get their heads chopped off, and you don't really want to be.
Well, thank you very much. It was a bit unfair of me to bind you into that, but that's the risk you take when you sit in the front row. There was a gentleman here, just behind him there. Sorry, you had your hand up first. Yeah, there, and then I'm going to take maybe one from here, and I might come over here as well.
Thank you, and thanks to the panel. I think that was a very interesting way to end the summer school. To be honest, it is a little bit hurtful as an Irish person from the north, to hear Mary cite bonfires last week as a reason why I should not have the vote. I think that's nonsense. So I just want to make that point. I think there are many people like me who are Irish, who have only ever been Irish, that live in the north, who would like to have a say. The main question I wanted to ask was about the other aspect you discussed, sort of the diaspora. The reality of Ireland today is that the youth are in Melbourne, they are in Vancouver. There's not a person in this room who will not have a child or a grandchild who would love to come back to Ireland if they could have a better life there. Why should those people not have a say if that is their intention?
David Kenny, why should they not have a say?
Well, it's simply the case at the moment that they can't, because the way our constitution is set up kind of prevents it. But there is no reason that we couldn't change that, and we could change it for the presidency, but we would need probably to have a referendum. But there is a broader question that I think we have to think about, as the commenter said there, that when people are living around the world and they may have aspirations to come home, there are lots of ways to represent emigrant constituencies. That needs thought, and it needs careful design, and you need to think about what those representatives stand for and how they represent those people in your parliamentary system. But we have the Seanad, we have the possibility.
But what was
of
really interesting with David, this debate has been around since the 80s. There was a time when there was a real momentum building around it, getting into the programme of government, and then it's just sort of silently fallen off it. Is that just because the fear generally of political reform referenda, or the fear that it would be lost?
Yeah, political reform referendums don't fare well in Ireland. Very, very few have passed, and the ones that have are minor. So anything relating to the electoral system or giving significant new powers to the Oireachtas or anything like that haven't done very well. Now, the ones that we have succeeded in are things like lowering the voting age. So, like the expanding the franchise is something that Irish people have approved in a referendum before. I think it probably would have potentially made a programme for government this time, if not for the very difficult experiences of the two referendums in 2024, which I think has given the government cold feet about more referendums in the near future. There are actually no referendums in the programme for government this term at all. We might have one on the International Patent Court. You can't wait for that. It's going to be so exciting. An issue so obscure that almost no one really understands it. Other than that, I think there won't be a referendum for a while if the government can.
I'm going to go to this gentleman.
Just to say, I think my point was there needs to be a greater understanding of the shared island before we get that far. That was just a symbol of it.
Thank you very much. This is how democratic I am as a facilitator. I'm going to the gentleman in pink because Mary and I are wearing pink. There we go. It's as good a reason as any.
Brian Sheridan, could I ask David, he referred to two powers that the President have. Am I not correct in saying that there is a third, admittedly esoteric, and also like the power to refuse a dissolution has never been used, but where a bill has been passed by both houses of the Oireachtas upon a petition of a majority of the Seanad and not less than 1/3 of the Dáil, he can refer the bill to a referendum. My second question is to Mary Hanafin. and she referred to the people of Ireland loving the President. And I just wondered, in the context of the office of the President, which does she think is more important, that the President be respected or the President be loved? Clearly, he or she could be both, but my question is, which does she think is the most important? And finally, to the whole panel, is not the function of the President under the Constitution crystal clear? It is a Republican substitute for a constitutional monarch, with the circumscribed as is a constitutional monarch, and therefore it's not the ideal candidate somebody who has A, done the state some service, B, can represent us internally and externally, and C, can accept with humility the limitations which the Constitution imposes on the office.
Mayor Hanafin, I'll go to you first of all.
I think I made the point that Michael D particularly is loved, and I stand by that. I think he really is. Of course, to be respected is much more important. It helps to be loved as well. But to be respected in your role and in the work that you do, it's the important thing.
Ian, to be respected or loved, or is it, again, going back to that question we had at the very outset, that perhaps actually the role of the President is clear after all? It is for all of the reasons that Brian listed, and maybe we don't need to change the definition.
I don't think we need to change it, but I did agree with Sean saying that presidents need some kind of theme. They need something they're offering in terms of an inspiration, and that can be in a particular domain. And I'd personally like to see presidents creating some kind of presidential honour system to reward people, who are fulfilling something in
like
that
our
field.
Distinguished people overseas. And
but more for internally much more. Yeah.
Loved or respected, Sean Gallagher? What they should be, or should they be both?
I think respected and inspirational in terms of what you're trying to do for the country. And I was just sharing a story recently with Cathal, and I were talking about the understanding of the role. And I don't know if you remember where you were on the 23rd of May 2011. And this goes to how difficult it is and why so many people are coming out that don't understand the role and the access to it. Was on the 23rd of May 2011, Cathal and I, my campaign man who's here, we were sitting having tea in a house in Curraby with Councillor Tony Ward and his wife Nora. And at 6 o'clock, the news came on as Tony was walking across the table to serve his tea, and it was Barack Obama addressing thousands of people in College Green. And Tony looked at Cathal and I and said, "How come you pair of boys are down here with me and not up with the good and the great in Stephen's Green with Barack Obama?" To which we in chorus responded, "Because Barack Obama doesn't have a vote on Roscommon County Council." And that was in May. So I come, truthfully, I am not unaccustomed to politics. When I was 28, I was Rory O'Hannon's political secretary back. I was reared in it, I understand it. But one of the things I want to finish with before you wrap up is this, and I said I wanted to talk about social media because I think it's vital, and I want to talk about the media. And in every downturn and in everything we have in all our lives, we have to find a positive. In all my life, I've always tried to find a positive in the downside. And it's this, and you'll know Noel Whelan, the late Noel Whelan, who was a barrister and a political commentator and a close friend.
And who was once, many people wanted him to have a candidacy and run.
Correct. Well, Noel and I shared a house together for 5 years. We were close friends. And when I had the issue with the fake tweet, I said to Noel, in the interest of truth and fairness, I've got to take a case against RTE because they refused to open up and be transparent about what happened. I've got to take this case. And Noel, with his barrister hat and political hat, he said, "Sean, I make two predictions to you. One, it's almost impossible to take on the state legislature. And the second one, I'll tell you what it was." And I said, "I'm resilient and determined for myself, for my kids who are just 1 or 2, when they're older, that they will Google me, which they're doing now, and that my reputation will be intact. Secondly, I owed it to my team who had campaigned tirelessly, and to the 500,000 more who voted for me in that year, to honour them, and also to everybody who my legacy would be, whoever came after me would guarantee fairness." And in 2000, while we can't control social media, every election since then, 2016 Dáil election, 2018 presidential, the 2020 general election, the 24 general election, and the now 25, they will be governed in terms of RTE guidelines that did not exist before my legal case. That will be my legacy for every candidate to stand.
But what would you say then to that? Because obviously that's well established and known, and I think that you have said that is the fairness you've hoped to have brought forward. What about the social media landscape more broadly? Like, I mean, what Mary was talking about, that anonymity or not knowing who it is. Do you think, like, I mean, as David has kind of alluded to, that regulating the online world can be very, very challenging? So what do you think would need to happen? Maybe, do you think the tech companies should be more broadly regulated or interrogated?
Yes, 100%. And I do for this reason is, I don't know anywhere in any other environment other than on tech platforms that you can create a false account with a name that nobody understands and that you can go out and defame everybody in this room and not be held accountable. I would absolutely, tomorrow morning, penalise any technical platform, technology platform, that does not have some proof of the name of the person who is issuing all these.
And of course, it's broader debates around that around the world. Would people be able to, in a broader sense, and in countries where people cannot show their?
I think it's possible. I just think there's no will on behalf of the technology companies because they're making so much money. Absolutely, what it takes is now is a courage and determination. Nobody should be subject to abuse from a hidden, nameless person, and worse, as we saw in all the campaigns, it isn't one person writing an email, a scurrilous email to Mary. It's a computer bot that's generating 100 different names, that's sending them into all the TV and radio stations and purporting to be somebody they're not. That is skewing. But the one thing that's important is that when we get to the national media, that we need to make sure that as the trusted entity, is safe and protected for everybody.
I want to go to the under-35s because we've had a lot of talk about the under-35s. Can I have the mic for this young lady here? Yes, we will answer your... David said it was a very nerdy question. It was a bit of a nerdy question, Brian. It's a bit of a nerdy question. This young lady.
Although it's a role outside of the political sphere, do you think it's at all important or not that the President has knowledge of or experience with international law, diplomacy, international relations or history in order to deeply connect with the Presidency?
Better ask the lawyer on the panel this one. David, people who kind of come in through the political process tend to be, if not initially familiar, become familiar over time kind of with laws, legal processes, legislation. There's a huge synergy between the legal profession and the political system. Do you think that you need that, or is that something you learn on the job? Yeah, I think there is a lot of learning on the job, and particularly for the constitutional aspects of the job. The President appoints a Council of State, and the President can bring in experts on their Council of State to advise them, perhaps on certain aspects of the job that they might feel less comfortable with, like knotty points of constitutional law or things like that. Particularly when you're referring a bill, that there's a big fuss made of the Council of State coming in. The Council of State meets before the President refers a bill in order to give advice on that question. And so the President can surround himself with some people to provide that expertise. In terms of diplomacy and international law and international relations, I think there are lots of ways to show that you have the qualities needed to engage diplomatically and to engage on the international stage. And so I think our campaigns are trying to tease out if people have those skills, and there's lots of different ways to show them. Can I very briefly answer, Brian? You can indeed, we can't let you go. Because Brian, I was just delighted when you asked that question, because when I was thinking earlier, would I talk about the third one, I decided not to, because it's so obscure. I'd say most of my constitutional law students don't know about it. There is a third power. Under Article 27, as Brian said, that the President can call a referendum on an ordinary bill, an ordinary law, where the two houses of the Oireachtas have disagreed, and a certain number of members have asked the President, the Seanad members have asked the President to call a referendum. It's never been used or even come close, because as of when I last checked, which would have been a few years ago, the Seanad had rejected only 2 bills ever. One was going to go to a referendum anyway, because it was a bill to amend the Constitution, and the other was, I think, the Pawnbrokers Act of 1959, which, as far as I can tell... That is so sad that we're discussing this. I know, and it's Brian's fault.
And the reason that it was rejected, as far as I can tell, is that Charlie Haughey, as Minister for Justice, was so rude to the senators, they rejected the bill to try and teach him a lesson.
Sorry,
and you'll see on Google tonight, everybody Googling pawnbroker. And I cannot unhear that piece of information.
Can I just, for briefly go back on the little bit of knowledge goes a long way. It's also in the Constitution that the President has to sign a bill between 5 days and 7 days. So the President doesn't have a legal advisor like the government has the Attorney General. You really only call the Council of State if you're thinking of sending it to the Supreme Court. So I think the idea that the President would have knowledge and background in law, says the new devil who was just called to the bar last year, I think would be a help, not necessary, but you do have that very narrow window before you actually sign the legislation.
Can I ask you, just I'm going to wrap up now, but Mary, I might just begin with you for some final thoughts and reflections. It's an if, and perhaps a big if you're going to get onto the ticket. Why are you running, or what will your mission be, that moral elevation? What would you given the amount of deterrent factors that might put you off running for it, but what is it that makes you want to go for this role?
I would like to run because I've 30 years of public service, 30 years of acting as a minister, introducing the DESH scheme for disadvantage, sitting across the table from the mother with child with special needs, dealing with the everyday problems that people have that I think would reflect who you are as a person. I would hope to bring my experience both nationally and internationally, having represented the country abroad, having worked with women in the last few years in the Middle East and North Africa on good governance with the OECD, bringing that to bear as well. And I think particularly, no matter what your political experience is, everybody has life's experiences. And I think my life experience is such that a word that actually has come up an awful lot here tonight is something that I would bring as my platform, which is resilience. I think I have been lucky enough, despite all of the knocks that we all experience, to bounce back each time. I think it is something that the Irish people have done for generations, whether it was out of colonisation, out of a famine, out of war, out of recession. The Irish people are really resilient, and I would hope to bring my personal resilience to reflect on the nation's resilience in my dealings with the general public, with young people whom I work with all the time and encouraging them, and in reflecting that abroad.
Sean Gallagher, notwithstanding your own personal experiences, it's kind of hard when people say a failed presidential candidate, because when you get to the manner of votes that you got, it's hard to apply that. One person can win. Do you have any regrets about going through the process, and what advice would you have for anyone who is considering running? Because I presume your phone must be ringing with people asking you to, scoping out a potential run at the Irish.
I think I read a book many years ago written by a fabulous doctor called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who worked with people who are dying in hospices and grief. Yeah. And the great takeaway I had from that is this: when we all get to the end of our lives, the regrets that we have are not about the things that we did, but about the things that we left undone. So if anybody has a desire, and I say this to kids in school, a ship in the harbour is safe, but that is not where ships were built for. If you have skills, talent, abilities and a vision, step forward. So I would have
That's Mark Twain, sail away from the safe harbour.
Exactly. Leave the security of the shore. I would have encouragement for two groups of people as I leave this platform from my heart. A lived experience. The first is for anybody who thinks that they can contribute to the country in this office or any other office. My call to action is, be brave. If not me, who? If not now, when? We need people to stand forward. The second thing of encouragement I would have are to all the candidates who do stand forward, and to all the media, correspondents and programmes and producers and editors who write about them, to please be respectful, interrogate them, check their backgrounds, all of them, but do it in a respectful and a fair manner, because you're not just damaging that person's reputation, you're damaging more people coming forward that we rely on for the future of our very democracy.
And Ian Robertson, just on that, the fact is that someone has to occupy that role. It's a very important role, and the process can deter people who might otherwise think of coming forward. But there is that sort of other human instinct where, as we were saying earlier, that it is a blood sport and perhaps that people might secretly enjoy at some level. So what is your advice to candidates?
My advice is to know why you're running, really bring it to mind, and do what Mary says and ignore. Just don't read the nonsense. And do what Sean says and realise that you have to take action. As Rumi, the Persian poet, said, the way only appears with the first step. Take the first step.
Take the first step. And for our last step for this panel this evening, David Kennedy, I might just go back to you, because to maybe just answer a question that we asked at the very outside is, why does the presidency matter? We've been at it for 90 minutes. It does.
It does. I think, it goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning. The major offices of state are indirectly elected in this country. We don't get to directly choose our Taoiseach. It's a product of a whole host of factors, and our votes somewhere there toward the bottom, but it's not close to the centre of power. This is a time when we all have the privilege, if we are citizens living in this country, to vote for someone who represents a set of values that we believe in, to elect someone who can lead morally, if not politically and legally. And it's one of the experiments of our constitution was to try and find a republican equivalent to a constitutional monarch. The office does that. It works and it performs that function well, and we're privileged to get to elect someone to that office this year.
It is a privilege indeed, and it is courage for those who do put their ideas before the crowd. So I think, just even based on tonight's conversation, the final debate before the school closes out, it's been my privilege to speak with Mary, with David, with Ian and Sean, and thank you so much. And we're going to hand over to the school. Thank you.